The groom's laughter died when the church doors opened. Cold air moved through the chapel as the heavy doors swung inward, carrying with it the scent of rain, leather, and something older than fear. Candlelight trembled against polished oak pews. White roses, arranged for a celebration that had already curdled into cruelty, seemed to shrink under the sudden weight of a new presence. At the altar, the bride still stood frozen in her simple ivory gown, fingers shaking around a bouquet she no longer seemed to feel, while the man who had just refused her wore the last broken pieces of a smug smile. Marco DeLuca did not rush. Power like his never needed to. His black suit looked cut from midnight, severe and flawless, his silver cuff links catching one brief flare of stained glass light as he walked down the center aisle. Men twice his size remained near the doorway, silent, disciplined, unmistakably dangerous. The guests knew him before anyone dared say his name. Some lowered their eyes. Others reached for the backs of the pews as if wood might steady them. Even the priest forgot the next line in his prayer book. The bride, Naomi Bennett, lifted her gaze slowly, not in hope, in disbelief. Ethan Mercer, still standing where he had humiliated her moments earlier, gave a short laugh that sounded hollow now. This is a private ceremony. Marco stopped 3 steps from the altar and looked at him the way a judge might look at a liar already caught. His face held no heat, only control so complete it became terrifying. And yet, he said, voice low and clean as a blade, you made her shame public. The room went silent. Naomi's throat tightened. She knew the name. Everyone in the city did. Marco DeLuca owned nightclubs, shipping routes, politicians' secrets, and enough fear to move entire rooms without touching a soul. Men like him belonged in rumors, in headlines with missing details, in whispered warnings from mothers to daughters. Not in churches, not in the wreckage of a wedding. Ethan straightened, trying to reclaim the crowd he had just entertained with her humiliation. This isn't your business. A flicker passed through Marco's eyes. Then he looked at Naomi. That was the first true shift. Not possession, not pity, recognition. The smear of foundation failing to hide the redness around her eyes. The small tear in the hem near her left shoe. The way she stood upright despite the collapse arranged around her. A woman abandoned in front of everyone she loved, and still refusing to beg. Is that true? Marco asked her. The question landed heavier than any threat because it gave her something she had been denied all morning. Choice. Naomi swallowed. Her mother was crying in the front pew. Her uncle looked away, ashamed he had done nothing. Half the guests were waiting for her to break, because broken women made people feel safe about their own cowardice. She did not break. No, she said, her voice trembling once before it steadied. It became your business the moment he turned me into entertainment. Ethan's face hardened. He had expected tears, pleading, collapse. He had not expected her to answer like that in front of everyone. Comment below if you've ever seen dignity returned in a single sentence. Marco gave the smallest nod, as if something had just been confirmed. Then he climbed the final step to the altar and stood beside her, not in front of her. It was a subtle thing, but everyone saw it. Ethan scoffed. What are you going to do, by the church too? No, Marco said. One breath, one glance at Naomi, then the sentence that split the morning in half. Then she's mine. Gasps rippled through the chapel. Naomi's fingers loosened around the bouquet until 3 white petals dropped onto the floor between them. The priest stepped back so quickly his robe brushed a candle stand. Naomi turned to Marco fully now, searching his face for mockery, for spectacle, for the next version of male cruelty dressed in richer fabric. She found neither. You don't even know me, she whispered. I know enough, Marco said. Silence settled over the chapel with the weight of a verdict. White roses breathed their sweet scent into air sharpened by humiliation, rainwater, and candle smoke. Every guest seemed to understand that whatever happened next would stain more than a wedding day. It would decide whether Naomi left that altar as a discarded woman or as someone no one in that room could ever dismiss again. The priest looked from Naomi to Marco with trembling confusion, then to the rows of stunned faces waiting for permission to gossip. Marco gave none. His black suit sat on him like armor cut from midnight, severe and immaculate. But his voice, when he spoke again, was measured rather than cruel. If she agrees, he said, finish the ceremony. A murmur moved through the pews, shocked and hungry. Naomi's mother covered her mouth. Her former groom, Daniel, found his voice too late. "This is insane," Daniel snapped. "You can't just take someone's place like you're buying a car." Marco turned only his eyes toward him. "And yet," he said, "you abandoned her as if she were worth less." The room went still. Naomi stood between them with the bouquet hanging at her side, no longer like a bride, not yet like anything else. Her pulse hammered against the hollow of her throat. Every lesson fear had taught her said this was another cage, only lined in velvet instead of cheap promises. But Daniel had already shown her what waiting for mercy earned. Public ruin, private shame, a life decided by cowardly men. So this time, she made the room wait for her. "What are the terms?" she asked. That was the moment everything changed. Several guests gasped again, but Marco's expression did not shift. If anything, something almost like respect passed briefly through his face. He stepped closer, not enough to touch her, only enough so she would not have to raise her voice for the chapel to hear. "You keep your name," he said. "No one controls your money. No one touches you without your permission. If at any point you want out, you tell me to my face." Daniel let out a bitter laugh. Listen to him. He makes marriage sound like a contract. Naomi finally looked at Daniel the way one looks at smoke after a fire has already burned the house down. "It always was," she said. Comment below if you've ever seen dignity returned in a single sentence. A flicker passed through Marco's cold gaze then, not softness, not warmth, but recognition. He was used to fear, submission, calculated smiles. Not this. Not a woman standing at an altar, stripped of illusion, asking for terms as if survival had already taught her the price of blind trust. She asked one more question. "Why me?" Rain ticked against the stained glass windows. Somewhere near the back pew, someone shifted and the wood creaked in the hush. "Because men like him survive when good women are left alone in rooms full of witnesses," Marco said. "I won't be one of them." Naomi searched his face again. Not for kindness now. For weakness. For the crack that would reveal a performance. But his stare held steady, brutal in its honesty. He was not pretending this was romance. He was offering protection in the only language he believed in. Power, boundaries, consequence. And she understood that better than flowers and vows. "Then one more term," Naomi said. Marco waited. "My life does not become one of your trophies." A long beat passed. Candlelight moved across the sharp line of his jaw. "You won't be owned," he said. "Not by me. Not by anyone." For the first time that day, Naomi breathed fully. The priest, pale and sweating, looked as if he wanted divine intervention or early retirement. But when Marco nodded once, the older man opened his book with shaking hands. The ceremony that followed was stripped of every illusion weddings are supposed to wear. No violin swelled. No smiling groom reached for a future built on promises. Rain tapped against the chapel windows like a quiet warning. At the back of the sanctuary, a man in a dark coat stood motionless beneath the stained glass spill of red and gold, his face half hidden in shadow. He was not a guest anyone had noticed when the doors first opened, and that alone made the priests uneasy. Marco's men went still at the sight of him, because they knew that posture, that silence, that kind of cold patience. It belonged to men who did not arrive by accident. It belonged to the past. The priest's hand trembled over the open book. Naomi's fingers tightened around the bouquet she no longer felt worthy to hold. Then the stranger lifted a sealed envelope and held it up without speaking, as if the entire room had already been sentenced. Marco's jaw hardened. "Read it." The man in the coat walked forward slowly, shoes soundless on the stone aisle. He did not look at the bride. He looked only at Marco, with the flat certainty of someone carrying old blood and older debt. When he reached the front, he set the envelope on the altar beside the rings. "From Vittorio Bianchi," he said. The name landed like a gunshot. A few guests recoiled. One woman covered her mouth. Marco did not move, but the muscle in his cheek twitched once, sharp as a blade. Naomi saw it then, not fear, exactly, but recognition. Something buried. Something dangerous. The seal was broken. Inside was a single photograph and a short note. In the photograph, a younger Marco stood beside a woman Naomi had never seen, but whose expression was impossible to mistake. She was smiling through tears, one hand pressed to her stomach, the other clutching Marco's wrist as if he had promised her the world and broken it. The note beneath it was uglier than the picture. "If you finish this marriage, the truth about Lena dies with you." The chapel seemed to shrink. Naomi looked from the photograph to Marco's face, and for the first time, she saw not the mafia boss, not the man of marble and steel, but a man cornered by a ghost. He took the note from the altar, read it once, and his expression went colder than the rain outside. "Who is Lena?" Naomi asked. No one answered at first. The silence was heavy enough to crush the candles. Then the messenger said, "The woman he was supposed to protect." Marco folded the paper in his fist. The old threat was no longer just rumor, no longer just a shadow behind the ceremony. It had entered the room, taken a seat at the altar, and demanded blood. He turned to Naomi, and for the first time since he had stood beside her, his voice carried something raw beneath the authority. "This does not touch you." But the lie was too careful. Too late. Naomi saw it immediately. Whatever had happened between Marco and Lena, whatever promise had been broken, it had just dragged itself into her new life and planted its boots in the middle of the aisle. The past had found the wedding, and now it was asking for a price. The man in the coat stepped back into the aisle and opened the chapel doors just enough for the storm to breathe inside. "You have until midnight," he said. "After that, everyone learns what really happened to her." The room went silent. Marco did not look away from the doorway. He only set his hand over Naomi's for one hard, steady second, as if to say that whatever came next, it would not find her undefended. Then he lifted his eyes toward the dark outside and made a decision that would cost him more than money, more than reputation, more than the marriage itself. And Naomi realized the wedding had just become a war. Thunder rolled so far in the distance it sounded less like weather than an old threat clearing its throat. The chapel had begun to empty, but not with relief. Guests slipped out in clusters, whispering behind gloved hands, casting looks over their shoulders as if scandal itself might follow them into the parking lot. Candle flames shook in their brass cups. Wet footprints marked the aisle in dull crescents. The white roses near the altar were already browning at the edges, as though the day had aged 10 years in a single hour. Naomi stood in the vestry because it was the only room small enough to breathe in. Her wedding gown, altered in haste after becoming something no one had planned, felt heavier now, the satin clinging cold against her ribs. Beyond the half-open door, men moved through the hallway with the quiet precision of trained danger. Not police, not family, Marco's people. Then the door clicked shut behind her. Not locked, closed. The difference mattered. Marco had entered without sound, though nothing about him was small enough to disappear. Rain darkened the shoulders of his black coat. A thin line of blood marked one knuckle, not fresh, not explained. In the low amber light, his face looked carved from fatigue and restraint rather than stone. That was what unsettled Naomi most. Monsters were easier when they looked like monsters. "You should have guards inside the room," she said, keeping her voice level. "And make you feel caged?" he asked. The answer came too fast, too human. Naomi looked at him fully then, searching for the calculation she had expected since the moment he stepped into her ruin and claimed it as his own. She had prepared herself for ownership, for strategy, for the cold terms of a man who traded in fear. What she found instead was something harder to survive. Care. He crossed the room and set a folded towel on the chair beside her, not on her shoulders, not touching her without permission. "You're shaking." "I'm cold." "You're angry." That was true enough to sting. For a moment, neither of them moved. Rain ticked against the narrow vestry window. Somewhere deeper in the church, a pew scraped across stone, then silence folded back over everything. Marco watched her the way men watched unstable ground. Carefully, respectfully, aware it could break under the wrong step. "I need to understand something," Naomi said. "Why would a man like you take this risk for a woman he doesn't know?" His jaw shifted once. The question did not offend him. It wounded him. "Because I knew a woman once," he said, "who stood alone in a room full of people who decided her pain was entertainment." The air changed. No grand confession followed. No dramatic turn of posture. He only looked toward the crucifix on the far wall, and for the first time since Naomi had met him, his gaze did not hold power. It held memory. "My mother cleaned houses in this city," he said. "Rich homes. Polished floors, silver frames, locked liquor cabinets she was accused of stealing from every other month." His voice stayed even, but something beneath it had sharpened into old glass. "One family fired her in front of their dinner guests because a bracelet went missing. They made her empty her purse onto a marble floor. Lipstick, bus fare, church mints, asthma medicine. They laughed while she bent to pick it all up. Naomi did not speak. She never stole a thing, Marco said. The bracelet was in the daughter's coat pocket. They found it the next day. No apology. No repair. Just silence. Because silence is how powerful people bury what they are ashamed of. The room went still. There it was, the first crack. Not softness exactly. Not innocence. Something more dangerous than either. A moral wound that had never scarred flat. Naomi had seen men hide cruelty behind charm. She had never seen a feared man hide grief behind discipline. So when they laughed at you out there, she said quietly, you saw her. His eyes returned to hers. A strip of white paper lay folded inside the marriage certificate folder, hidden so neatly it could have been missed by anyone who only cared about the signatures. Marco saw it because he never trusted ceremony more than shadows. The chapel was still, except for the rain ticking against the glass and Naomi's breathing, which had gone careful and shallow beside him. He opened the note with 2 fingers. It was a hospital transfer receipt. Not for Naomi. For a child. Marco's jaw hardened as he read the date, the room number, the surgeon's name, and the private security authorization stamped beneath it. The paper was old enough for the ink to have faded at the edges, but not old enough to be forgotten by the man who had paid for it. Naomi leaned in, and the color drained from her face when she saw the name at the top. Liam. The word did not sound like a revelation. It sounded like a wound reopening. Marco did not ask who the child was. He already knew this was the kind of secret men buried when they wanted obedience from everyone around them. He turned the paper over and found one more line, handwritten in a sharp, rich ink. If she ever learns what happened that day, she leaves. Naomi's fingers closed around the folder so tightly her knuckles went pale. The chapel seemed to shrink around them, every pew and candle and stained glass, saints suddenly watching. Her voice came out low, stunned, and raw. You knew my son was alive. Marco looked at her then, and for the first time since he had stepped forward at the altar, his face changed. Not with pity, not with calculation, with something colder and more personal. Recognition. That was why her groom had gone white when Marco's name was spoken. That was why the families at the back had been so eager to keep their eyes down. That was why the wedding had not been just a humiliation. It had been a cover. The truth hit her in pieces. The ring. The rushed ceremony. The private witnesses. The sudden panic in her groom's voice when Marco arrived. This had never been about love or betrayal alone. It had been about a child, a hidden transfer, and a deal made by people who believed grief could be used like money. Naomi stepped back once, as if the floor had tilted under her. Then she straightened. Tell me everything. The room held its breath. Marco's hand closed over the note, crushing it just enough to make the paper creak. For a man like him, that small sound was louder than shouting. He was not a priest. He was not a savior. But something in him had already crossed a line no threat could uncross. He was moved the night before the wedding, he said. Your groom's family signed the authorization. Yours never saw it. Naomi stared at him, and the hurt in her eyes changed shape. It became focus. It became resolve. So they didn't just ruin my wedding, she whispered. They used my child to do it. Marco did not answer. He did not need to. The rain struck harder now, drumming against the chapel like an approaching verdict. Naomi lifted the folder, looked at the transfer stamp again, and made the first choice that belonged only to her. Then we go get the truth. Marco's gaze sharpened, because now the danger had changed. This was no longer about what had been done to her. It was about who would be brave enough to pull the buried lie into daylight. And somewhere behind them, in the emptying church, one of the remaining guests quietly reached for a phone. The last of the wedding candles burned with a weak, uneven flame, bending each time the chapel doors opened and shut. Wet air drifted in from the storm outside, carrying the smell of rain, old wood, and something sharper now, fear exposed too late. Near the back pews, a ringtone had barely begun before Marco's men moved, not with panic, but with the smooth precision of men who had spent years stopping damage before it spread. The guest with the phone never made it to the second ring. A hand closed over his wrist. The device was taken. The message on the glowing screen was brief enough to chill the room. She has the folder. Tell Vincent. Naomi saw it from several feet away, and this time she did not wait for someone stronger to explain what danger meant. Her fingers tightened around the marriage folder. Her pulse jumped once, hard, but her face steadied instead of breaking. Survival would have told her to let Marco handle it, to stay silent, to let powerful men turn truth into strategy. But something had shifted the moment she chose not to hide the paper again. "I know that name," she said. Every eye in reach turned toward her. The man with the seized phone was pale now, sweat shining at his temple. Marco looked at Naomi, not interrupting, not rescuing, waiting. The silence around her felt larger than the chapel, as if the whole day had narrowed to one decision no one could make for her. "Vincent was my father's accountant," Naomi said, her voice low but clean. "After my dad got sick, Vincent started coming to the house every Friday. He always brought folders. He always told my mother not to worry." Her throat tightened, but she forced the words through it. 3 months after my father died, our house was gone." The guest with the phone shut his eyes. Marco's jaw hardened. "And your groom?" Naomi looked at the transfer stamp again. "He wasn't just leaving me at the altar. He was finishing something that started years ago." The truth landed without shouting. It did not need to. A marriage had not been arranged for love, or even humiliation alone. It had been designed as a legal seal, one final signature to bury theft beneath family respectability. Her husband-to-be had never merely rejected her. He had expected her to stand there, disgraced and confused, while the people who hollowed out her family took the last piece in public. The room went still. If this had been an hour earlier, Naomi might have cried, might have begged, might have asked whether any of it had ever been real. But public humiliation had burned something out of her, and in its place stood a colder, cleaner thing. Choice. She stepped toward the guest whose phone had betrayed him. "Call Vincent back." The man blinked. "What?" "Call him," Naomi said, stronger now. "Put it on speaker." One of Marco's men glanced at him for instruction. Marco gave none. His eyes remained on Naomi, watchful and unreadable, but there was something new in them now. Not pity, not command. Respect. The guest's hand trembled as the phone was returned just enough for him to dial. Rain rattled the stained glass windows. Somewhere far off, thunder rolled again, like a warning traveling over water. The line clicked. A man's voice came through, older, impatient. "Why are you calling me from inside the church?" Naomi took the phone before anyone could stop her. For the first time that day, she did not sound abandoned. "You should have taught your son better," she said. Silence answered her at first, then a slow inhale. "Naomi, I found the transfer stamp," she continued. "I know the property was moved before the wedding. I know the marriage license was meant to make the claim look clean after the fact. And I know Daniel walked away because he thought shame would keep me quiet." Across the chapel, someone whispered Daniel's name like it had become evidence. Vincent's voice lost its polish. "You don't understand what you're holding." "No," Naomi said. Lightning flashed against the stained glass windows, bleaching the chapel in a cold white glare that made every face look guilty for half a second. The folded paper trembled between Naomi's fingers, not because her hand was weak now, but because the room had finally understood what it was looking at. Rain struck the roof in hard, uneven bursts. The organist had stopped playing long ago, yet the silence felt louder than music. Vincent took one careful step down from the front pew, his polished shoes whispering against the old wood. Whatever charm had protected him in public was gone now. He no longer looked like a respected businessman overseeing a ruined wedding. He looked like a man measuring exits. "You found one stamp," he said, voice low, trying to gather control back into his hands. "That proves paperwork moved. Nothing more." From the side aisle, a chair scraped sharply. It was not Marco who moved first. Daniel's mother rose with both hands gripping the back of the pew, her pearls unsteady against her throat, her face drained of all social grace. For most of the day, she had played her role as witness, hostess, defender of appearances. Now something older and harder pushed through. Fear. Not for reputation anymore. For blood. "You liar," she whispered. The chapel heard it. Her eyes locked on Vincent, and in that instant Naomi saw recognition pass across the older woman's face like a blade catching light. Not surprise. Memory. Vincent's jaw tightened. He gave her the smallest warning shake of his head, but too late. The room had already shifted away from him. "You told us the transfer was legal," she said, louder now, voice cracking at the edges. "You told Daniel the marriage would only protect the estate from challenge. You said she would sign and never know." Every remaining guest went still. Marco did not interrupt. He stood beside Naomi like carved stone, one hand loose at his side, the other resting against the back of her chair, not touching her, but close enough to make the promise obvious. Luca and two of Marco's men had already moved without spectacle, sealing the side doors with the kind of quiet precision that made panic unnecessary and escape impossible. Vincent saw it, and ran anyway, not toward the main doors, toward the vestry. The motion was sudden, desperate, ugly. His shoulder hit one guest hard enough to spin him. Someone screamed. Wet shoe leather slipped on the aisle runner. A silver candlestick crashed from a pedestal and rolled, ringing across the floor like an alarm. Marco didn't chase. Luca. One word. Luca cut across the aisle with brutal speed, intercepted Vincent at the chapel arch, and drove him into the stone column hard enough to knock the breath out of him. A muffled groan escaped Vincent's mouth. His hand came free from his jacket with a small black pistol, but he never got to raise it. Another of Marco's men twisted his wrist down. The weapon clattered across the floor and stopped beneath the front pew. The room froze mid-breath. Blood appeared first at Vincent's lip, then at the edge of his temple where stone had opened the skin. Thin, red, sudden. The kind that made everyone remember this was no longer a scandal. It was a reckoning. Marco walked forward at last, slow enough to make fear grow teeth. You used a church to clean theft, he said. His voice was quiet, but it carried to the back row with lethal ease. You used a groom to abandon a woman at the altar so he could avoid the dirt. And when she saw too much, you expected shame to do what force could not. Vincent tried to laugh through the blood in his mouth. You think this ends with me? Marco's expression did not change. No, he said. It begins. Daniel's mother sank back onto the pew as if her bones had given out beneath the truth. One of the remaining guests quietly lowered a phone, no longer pretending to text. He had been recording. Others had heard enough, seen enough. The chapel did not erupt. It emptied itself of noise the way a body loses blood, suddenly, then all at once. Rain tapped against the stained glass windows. A candle near the aisle guttered and died, sending a thin thread of smoke into the cold air. No one moved fast anymore. Truth had done what fear, money, and family pressure had failed to do. It had stripped the room down to what each person really was. Naomi stood at the altar with the folded paper still in her hand, her veil pushed back, her face pale, but no longer fragile. The shaking had left her. In its place was something steadier, almost dangerous in its calm. Across from her, Daniel looked like a man who had finally seen the size of his own cowardice. He opened his mouth once, then shut it again when no excuse came. His mother was the first to break. She rose from the pew with both hands trembling against the wood and walked toward Naomi like every step cost her a year of pride. The pearls at her throat looked too small now, too soft for a woman who had tried to rule a life through humiliation. When she reached the front, she did not look at Vincent or Marco or the guests. She looked only at the young woman she had tried to crush in public. I was wrong, she said. The words landed harder than any scream. Naomi said nothing. Daniel's mother swallowed, and her voice thinned. I thought I was protecting my son, our name, our family. But all I protected was a lie. Her eyes filled, not with graceful tears, but with the ugly kind that arrive when dignity has to be rebuilt from ruin. You came here in honesty. We answered with cruelty. There is no apology big enough for that. The room went silent again. Then Daniel stepped forward, not as a groom, not even as a son with status left to spend, but as a man standing in the wreckage of his own choices. He took off the boutonniere from his lapel and let it fall to the marble floor. A small sound. Final. I knew enough to ask questions, he said, staring at Naomi instead of hiding behind anyone else this time. I didn't ask because the answer would have cost me comfort. I let them make you carry my fear. His jaw tightened. I don't deserve forgiveness, but I will not let them touch your name again. For the first time all night, Marco did not intervene. He watched, and in that pause, the meaning of everything changed. This was no longer about a powerful man rescuing a broken woman before a crowd. Naomi was no longer standing there because someone had claimed her in a moment of fury. She was standing there because she had survived the humiliation, uncovered the truth, and taken back the right to decide what happened to her own life. Marco finally reached inside his jacket. Several guests stiffened, but he drew out only the marriage license. The same paper that had begun as a weapon in the hands of other people now rested in his palm, with almost ceremonial care. He looked at Naomi, and for the first time since stepping into the storm around her, his voice held no command in it. "No debt," he said. "No bargain. No protection bought with your name." His dark eyes stayed on hers, unwavering. "If you walk away now, no one in this city will touch you. I'll make sure of that. If you stay because you choose me, not because you need saving." Even Vincent, bloodied and held in place, seemed to understand the weight of that moment. The chapel waited. Naomi looked at Daniel, at his mother, at the ruined flowers, the wet aisle, the guests who had come to witness her shame and were now trapped inside her vindication. Then she looked at Marco, the man whose first words had sounded like possession and whose last ones had become permission. That was the difference between being taken and being honored.